gave them. See, I tell other people, no, I studied for this. No, I went to school for this. But when it's me and God in the prayer closet, God's able to help me understand. Now, you know you didn't really give me much to work with. You know you was lying your face off. You know you was sleeping with anything that would walk. You know you didn't give me nothing to work with. But by the grace of God, when God's grace breathes on you, it takes your nothing and turns it into something. The grace of God is why I'm in this room. The grace of God is why I have another chance. The grace of God is why I know I'm going to see the goodness of God. The goodness of God and the grace of God that keep messing with me every time I think I'm giving him something, a value. He says, that's nothing to me. Let me breathe on it and expand it. I didn't give him nothing to work with. I didn't give him nothing to work with. I didn't have no ingredients. But God says, if you just give me what you have, if you just give me what you have, I know it doesn't seem like a lot. I know it looks like broken pieces. I know it may look like abortion. I know it may look like you died. I know it may look like you should be locked up. But if you give me something to work with, we could enter into an alliance where my grace and what you offer aligns in such a way that it is undeniable that grace went ahead of you. Yeah. Grace is an exchange. Grace is not just about consumption. Grace is not insurance for you to do whatever you like. I know, I'm sorry. I wanted to preach something real cute, but God told me I gotta really break down what grace is, because some of us do treat grace like it is insurance, and grace is gonna go ahead and I'm gonna make the mistake, but I believe grace is gonna cover me. When you really get a revelation of grace, you understand that if God ever gave me what I truly deserved, if God ever lifted his grace off of my life, then imposter syndrome would be right, because I have no business being where I am, but God's grace, was the grace of God that made the difference. And so when we see Paul talking about grace, and he says it is the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all. I see exchange here. I am the least of them, but God gave me the grace of God. I am what I am. He changed my identity. And then when he changed his identity, when he changed my identity, says Paul, when he changed the way that I saw myself, when he changed the way I saw what he was doing in the earth, I decided that his grace toward me would not be in vain. Because grace comes with a responsibility. Because I don't feel entitled to grace just because you allowed me to have grace on credit. God help me. Some people in this room got grace on credit. God says, I'm gonna give you grace first. And then when you step into the grace, I want you to live in such a way that I know that my grace was not in vain, that you recognize what this is. Because if you recognize what this is, you won't do that again. That's why we can love people with grace for real. I don't have to condemn you to make sure you don't make the same mistake over and over again. I just gotta be so good to you that you never wanna be bad to yourself again. I just gotta be so good to you that you never wanna go back to who you were before. It is the grace of God, the goodness of God that kept showing up in his life that says, now I feel obligated. What can I render unto you, God, for all that you have done to me? I feel obligated. I am a slave to the gospel, not because I did everything right, not because he actually chained me, but because he kept chasing me with his grace. And I finally turned around and I said, God, don't you know I'm raggedy? God, don't you know I'm bad? God, don't you know you could get somebody else, but you keep chasing me into this bar. You keep chasing me into this strip club. God, what is it that you want with me? God, what is it that you can do with these? Hallelujah. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 9. That's my scripture right there. Paul is expressing right before this how he's got this thorn in his flesh. Oh God, I feel like you want to do something in this place. God, I could almost be used, but I got this thorn in my flesh. God, I could almost be of use, but there's this thing that's piercing my soul. I could almost be like them. I could almost be perfect. I could almost hold my head up high. I could almost be in ministry. I could almost lay it down. And Jesus says to him, my grace. Once again, we're not talking about grace the way we've come to know it in church. We're talking about an exchange. This exchange that I made is sufficient for you because my strength is made perfect in weakness. That means that if you make this exchange the right way, it won't matter what the thorn is. It won't matter where you're weak. All that'll matter is that you made an exchange with me. You give me weakness and I give you strength. You give me freedom and I will give you a real call and a purpose. If you give it to me, I'll transform it. God says, I want to marry your weakness. Put it back on the screen for me. I want you to give me your weakness. I want you to give it to me. Don't give it to them. See, the reason that most of us end up with our hearts broken is because we were giving our weakness to other weak people. And we were hoping that if I give you my weakness, I'll finally feel strong. But Jesus is the reason why you needed him to walk away. The reason why you needed her to disappoint you is because you wanted her to do what only I could do. You wanted the job to be what only I could be. You wanted the check to do what only I can do. And that's why you're rich and still upset. And that's why you drugged out and still ain't got no peace. There is no drug greater than my grace. There ain't a drink on earth that can make you strong in the area you've been weak. It can help you forget. It can help you walk away. But if you want to be strong for real, you got to take that weakness and say, God, here I am, Lord. Here I am with my weak self. Here I am with my broke self. Here I am with my shattered self. The moment they call me, I go running out the door. I don't want to be weak anymore. I don't want to be weak like this anymore. This weakness is messing up my destiny. This weakness is messing up my family. This weakness is changing the way I see myself. This weakness is about to keep me from being who you've called me to be. You got to go to war with your weakness because your weakness gonna mess you up. But when you decide that I'm gonna let a weak thing keep me from a God thing, the weakness, it's in the way. It's in the way. That weakness is in the way. And you don't just get it out of the way by ignoring it. And you don't get it out of the way by pretending you're going to be confident in the place where you are weak. You can't affirm yourself out of this weakness. You can't post yourself out of this weakness. The only thing you can do with a weakness is yoke it up to something stronger than the area where you're weak. His name is Jesus. Oh God, I done got his name. Paul says, I knew I was weak, but when I got this revelation that my weakness can have a companion, my weakness can have a companion, and that companion is his strength. When I got that revelation, I did something crazy. I started boasting in my infirmities, because the more I boast about it, the more he breathes on it, and the more he breathes on it, the power of God rests upon me. But I'm trying to live a life that confuses the enemy. How in the hell did all of the hell I put her through not keep her from being? How did hell did all of the hell? The enemy sent hell to keep you from being who God has called you to be. I know it's confusing, but the hell didn't work. I know it's confusing, but the hell actually works for me, not against me. His strength was made perfect in the place where I experienced hell. You standing in evidence. Oh God, that's not my message. And I'm trying to calm down. But I just gotta let you know that you standing in the room where hell tried to attack me. You standing in the room where hell said, I'ma get her pregnant. So she never opens her mouth and going to put her in a room and tell her you'll never have access to the gift of God you see in everybody else. And heaven said, one day she going to give me all that hell she went through. Okay, hold on. I'm sorry. If you visited for the first time, I'm sorry. You don't even know me like that. But let me tell you something. I know something about the grace of God. I know something about the goodness of God. I know I don't have no business in this place. Okay. I'm going to boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I'm not going to whisper about these infirmities. I'm not going to ignore these infirmities. I'm going to make an exchange. I give God my weakness, my doubt, my insecurity, my need to perform, my need to be polished. I'm gonna give him my weakness. I'm gonna give him that broken little boy. I'm gonna give him that broken little girl. I'm gonna give him my weakness, my weakness. I'm gonna give him this addiction. I'm gonna give him my weakness. You see, we came in here and we looked the best that we can look. Part of it is because I'm trying to cover up some of this weakness. You think you got degree on top of degree because you really wanted education, and yes, that was it. But some of you were trying to cover up your weakness, and I hear God saying, you're trying to cover up the very thing I want to partner with. I don't want to partner with what looks good. I don't want to partner with the part of you that makes everyone feel good. I want to partner with the part of you that nobody wants, not even you. God says, that's the part that I want. I want your weakness. I want your brokenness. I want your bitterness. He left 20 years ago. You're still bitter. God says, give me that. You're not angry. You're hurting. You're not in pain. You're broken. I want your weakness. Oh, goodness. This exchange that we make with God requires that we really see the little bit of value that we bring. I have to tell you, culturally, this is challenging. Because culturally, we do live in a world that requires we find our confidence, that we find the best version of ourselves. And sometimes we get so high off our own supply that we don't see the gap between who we are and who God is. And you start to think to yourself, maybe I'm not that bad. I mean, I did do this, I did do that. But it is the grace of God, not the grace of man, that makes the difference. And just because you got favor in the eyes of man doesn't mean you did anything to get favor in the eyes of God. God is not impressed with what you have. God is impressed with all of who you are. And if you are not careful, you will allow your achievements and your pursuit of another crown to keep you from making a divine exchange. God told me the only way we survive this time that we're living in is not by how big we can make ourselves, but how much weakness we can find within ourselves. And I know you can point out weakness because you're good at pointing it out in everyone else, but what about that weakness inside of you? What about that speck in your own eye? Because it's weakness inside of me. And when I handle my weakness with care, it changes how I see your weakness, because I recognize that I wouldn't even have the sense that I have if it wasn't for the grace of God. And so maybe instead of prosecuting them, what we need to do is pray that they have an exchange with grace that helps them to understand you don't have to live that way. You don't have to talk that way, but I understand how you got that there, because there, but for the grace of God, there go I. I'm not even in my text. It was really interesting to me that God would give me a message about grace, but then take me into the Old Testament. Doesn't really align. Those of you who are real fancy scholars, y'all sit down. I don't know, I don't even know. We just reckless and unruly every time. Yes, child, sit down right there, make yourself at home. Welcome to the Potter's house. Welcome, yes, welcome. Take your shoes, I took my shoes off. One time I took my wig off, that didn't go over well for me. Helped a lot of people. I wondered why, for me, it didn't go well for me. I wondered why God took me to the Old Testament. Because traditionally, when we look at scripture, we think of the Old Testament as the law. And the New Testament we associate with grace. This is the traditional lines of demarcation when studying the Bible. We see the law as the list of rules that God gave to Israel, knowing that they could not fulfill them. That they would ultimately need the grace of Jesus' life in order to make up the difference for what they could not fulfill. Jesus fulfilled the law. He did what no one else could do, so that we can do what we have no business being able to do, because we didn't live in such a way that would allow us access to God. And yet God gave me this text about grace because he wanted me to understand that though grace is not the star of the Old Testament, grace is running in the background of the Old Testament. We see the word grace, the Hebrew word for grace, mentioned for the first time in Genesis 6. When God has looked at the earth and said, I'm so sorry that I made them. Which sometimes in 2023, I just be like, are we messing it up down here? And can you tell me, can I have a Noah anointing on my life? Because I think we messing it up a little bit down here. It says in Genesis 6, he looked at all of the earth and he was sorry that he made them. He says, but Noah found grace in his eyes. This concept of grace is not what we know of it now. This is the first time we see grace, and it taught me something about the way that grace is running in the background of the Old Testament. It taught me that ultimately, when Noah found grace in God's eye, that he found the ability to give to Noah what he could give to no one else. He found favor in God's eyes. And the thing about this is that it doesn't tell us much about Noah. It doesn't say that Noah was necessarily the most righteous man, the most faithful, that he did everything the right way. But there was something about Noah's heart posture that when God looked at him, he found grace. Oh God, that's a word within itself. Sometimes we are concerned about who we are connected to because we are afraid that who we are connected to may dissuade people in some way from wanting to be connected with us. But there is something to be said about man looking at the outward appearance, but God looking at the heart. God says, I know how to get through all of the mess that you're around to see the virtue and the favor that is still down on the inside of you. How did God decipher that Noah was the one? Because Noah understood something about God that other people didn't. It says that Noah found favor in God's eyes. What this taught me about the mystery of grace is that grace wasn't just something that we receive from God in the New Testament. It also taught me that when we find grace in God's eyes, that oftentimes grace makes the first move. God help me. Help me to say this the right way. Man, I gotta unpack this the way God gave it to me. When Noah finds grace in God's eyes, he gives Noah a download about what is to come. This helped me to understand that too often we see grace as a one-off. That there is grace that is confined to a particular situation. That God showed me grace in this one instance. And even when we talk about Noah finding grace in God's eyes, we kind of limit it to him giving the instruction that the flood is coming and he built the ark, and we kind of make it seem that that is the end of grace. But what I learned in reading this text is that when Noah found grace in God's eyes, that ultimately God invited him into a lifestyle of grace. Yeah. Because it's not just grace for you to be preserved. It also takes grace for you to build something you've never seen before. It requires grace for you to understand that there's going to be an element that you've never experienced that's going to hit the earth. It doesn't just take grace to get onto the ark and build the ark. There's a special kind of grace that also happens when the flood has withdrawn. And now I have to build my life again. And he invited him into a lifestyle of grace. And as long as we see grace as temporary, we will never give the level of obedience that unlocks a lifestyle of grace that allows us to stand in moments we would have never had access to. But for the grace of God, now I'm living a lifestyle of grace. I want to prophesy over somebody in this room that the moment that you recognize that you have found grace in the eyes of the Lord, that you have a responsibility to be obedient to that grace. I don't know who you are in this room, but God has told you time after time, I have graced you for this. I have graced you for something in the earth that only you can do. And you want to understand what's on the other side of the grace. I know I'm talking to somebody in this section because I keep getting pulled over here. I know that I have graced you for something, but you'll never see the fullness of what I have graced you for until you are obedient to the yes that is required in this moment. Maybe you're over here too, and God has graced you for something like Noah. I found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and I keep seeing this grace, but I don't trust this grace. I don't trust the grace that I found in the eyes of the Lord. Oh. So I would rather believe that grace is a one-off, that it saved me once, than to believe that there is grace for me to unpack in my life. Jesus, help me. Can you imagine, though we see grace for the first time as a word in Genesis 6, the first act of grace is really in Genesis 3. After Adam and Eve have eaten from the fruit, God told them in Genesis 2, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. That was the rule. That was the law. And they broke it, but they did not die. They got results that they didn't deserve, even though they broke the rules. And instead of them really dying, now an animal that was minding its business has to die to cover the thing that they should have never been in the first place. If that's grace, I don't know. If that's not grace, I don't know what is. Because how are you covering something that I messed up? Oh God, see some of you, oh Jesus, this is my word. Y'all can just hear my word. You see, there are some messes I got myself into. There are some things that God shouldn't have had to cover at all. There were some things where I should have thrown myself down at the mercy of the court and say, God, I did that, and whatever punishment I get is the one that I've earned. But God says, I'm actually not going to punish you. I'm going to cover you in a way that you could have never covered yourself. You took those little fig leaves and tried to cover that mistake you made. God says, I got something more durable to cover you. I got something that cannot be shaken. And I want you to sit back and look at the lengths I will go to cover you. God took an animal that did nothing wrong at all, but said, because I got to cover my child, I'm going to tell you this, and it might be a little bit, I don't know, it might be a little bit wrong to tell you, but I want you to know that there are people who will end up paying the consequences for what you did. And that's how you know that the grace of God is with you, because it really shouldn't have been them that lost their job. You owned up to the mistake and everything, but some kind of way God still preserved you. There were people who end up paying consequences for things that you should have been paying the consequence for. Some of you ought to be in jail. Some of you ought to be in the hospital. Some of you ought to be on food stamps and working from check to check, but somebody else is paying for consequences that didn't have anything to do with what they did. But because God said, for some reason, I'm going to cover you, and I'm going to... This is... Jesus. What I find interesting about this, in Genesis, when God shows them grace by slaughtering this animal to cover them, he does kick them out of the garden. And it proves to me that a version of their lives did die. Their life itself didn't die, But there was a version of life as they knew it that ended in that moment. It helped me understand another mystery of grace that I think is important for all of us to know. That even though life as you know it may have ended, maybe you're not in the same city, maybe that person is never coming back to life. Grace is not always about keeping that life alive. Sometimes grace is about showing you how to live again in a new world. Their life didn't end the way that it should have, but God paves the way for them to experience life again. That's grace too, is that you can have joy again, that you can have peace again. Not that the situation goes back to being what it was, but sometimes grace is, I can't change what happened, but I can offer you the opportunity to live again in a way you never thought was possible. I wish that would have never happened. I wish that your life would have been preserved. I wish it would have stayed protected, but my grace is sufficient enough to help you understand that on the other side of this heartbreak, there is a life again, and that life still allows you to be fruitful and multiply, and that life still allows you to have dominion. I got a plan, and this is why we've got to acknowledge that grace does exist in the Old Testament, because Jesus was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, which means that even in Genesis and even through all of the Old Testament, when we see God giving chance after chance after chance, that what we're really seeing is him setting up a template of grace where you don't always do the right thing and you don't always get the right yeses, but because I so believe in who you can become, I'm going to show you that there's life after mistakes. I'm going to show you there's life when you should have been dead. There are some of you in this room who are sitting next to a corpse and you don't even know it, but because God allowed them to live again, that thing that is sitting next to you is someone who has been resurrected. That thing sitting next to you is someone who had suicidal thoughts and thought, I shouldn't be here. You sitting next to a corpse. I didn't even want to live to see another day, but for some reason the grace of God gave me another chance, and now the life that I'm living is really not my own. The life that I'm living is the life that I was resurrected to embody. The life that I'm living is the life that God said, if you can just hang on and survive, I'm going to bring you back to life. I want to prophesy to somebody in this room, and you've been feeling like you're on your last leg. You've been feeling like this life is over. You've been feeling like there is nothing else for you to do in the earth because you've made so many mistakes, because you've been the victim of so many mistakes. And I hear God saying that I can bring you back to life. I hear God saying that resurrecting power, there's grace on the other side of this for you to live again. I don't know who stole from you. I don't know who betrayed you. I don't know what betrayal you allowed to happen on your own, but I hear God saying that there is life after your shame. There is life after your heartbreak. There is grace for you to live again. I dare you to take a deep breath and let the devil know you should have killed me when you had the chance, but for some reason he keeps breathing air into my lungs. I hear God saying that your breath is a threat to the enemy, because your breath is a reminder that my grace is still sufficient. Your breath is a reminder that though he slay me, I can still trust in him. Your breath is a reminder that he's not finished with me yet. My story is still being written. Heaven is still rejoicing when I wake up in the morning. Hell tried to unleash hell on me, but heaven kept pulling me back. Heaven kept chasing me down. I think I'm gonna go on and live again. I think I'm gonna go on and try again. I think I'm gonna go on and elect myself to get back in position so that I can become all that God has called me to be. I think I'm gonna try anyway. I think I can still be fruitful. I don't know who you are. You've been in a drought, but I hear God saying, get ready for rain, because the moment you get a revelation that my grace sees past your drought, I'm gonna unlock the windows of heaven and I'm gonna pour you out a blessing that you don't have room enough to receive. What is that blessing? That blessing is getting your mind back. That blessing is getting your heart back. That blessing is getting your hunger back. There's a grace. There's a grace, there's a grace, there's a grace after this. There's a grace after this. There's a grace after this. That grace says, if you give it to me, I'll transform it. There's a grace after this pain. There's a grace after this. There's a grace after this. I don't know who you are, but I hear God saying there's a grace coming. There's a grace coming. Keep your eyes open. You're going through life with your eyes shut. I hear God saying, keep your eyes open. I'm about to show you what grace looks like. I'm about to show you what grace sounds like. Make sure the volume is up on your phone, because I want want you to hear grace when it starts ringing. I want you to hear grace when it starts knocking on your door. I prophesy for somebody in this room that before I see you again on Sunday, that you're going to have an encounter with grace. That grace is going to wake you up in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden where you were weeping, somebody's going to wake up laughing. I think grace just woke me up out of depression. I think grace just woke me up out of stupid. Grace, 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 grace. Grace, 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 grace. I need it in my marriage. I need it at my job. I need it in my forgiveness. I need it in my pain. I need it in my bitterness. I gotta give you grace because I'm making room. Jesus. 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 Jesus, 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 Jesus. I think somebody's making room for grace. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I've been making room for doubt. I've been making room for worry. I've been making room for things to go bad. But I hear God saying, I need you to make some room for grace. I know you see how it could fail, but do you see how I could take things and do exceedingly and abundantly above all that you could ask for or imagine? I need you to get in the mindset of grace. I need you to get in the posture of grace. I need you to free your feet so you can dance. I need you to move your arms so you can praise, because in a minute a grace wave is going to hit this place. The grace is coming like a wave. It's coming like a wave. It's coming like a wave. It's coming like a wave. Don't look at the news. The news don't know nothing about this wave. Don't look on your timeline. Your timeline don't know nothing about this wave. This grace wave that's coming, it's going to move you from where you have been and place your feet on solid ground. Who are you? You've been sinking. Who are you? You've been drowning. God says grace is about to carry you to shore. Grace. Grace. Jesus. I think God gave me this text. I gotta finish. I think God gave me this text because Elijah experienced God's grace. Elijah was drinking in a drought, eating in a famine. Elijah experienced God's grace. And he was not just a consumer of God's grace. He was obedient to the grace that was on his life. Even when that grace almost risked him his entire life, he couldn't separate the fact that, yes, I may be afraid, yes, I may be distraught, but at the end of the day, if God says arise and eat, I'm going to be obedient, because the grace that is on my life requires obedience. And if I am not obedient, then I will be disconnected from that grace. I don't even want to risk being disconnected from that grace. I want to stay so connected to that grace that I can be obedient and still distraught. I can be obedient and still nervous. I can be obedient and still unsure, because at the end of the day, my obedience is about the grace, not my emotions. My obedience is about God's faithfulness, not my emotions. My obedience is about his grace. It is not about the rumors. I am obedient because grace chased me down. Grace preserved me. And the same grace that did it then, I believe that it's going to do it again. And I want to be in the room when it happens. I want to be in the room when grace shows up. I want to be in my body when grace shows up. I want to watch that child when grace shows up. I want to watch that ministry when grace shows up. And if I give up, I may miss when grace makes its next move. And Elijah's successor, Elisha, is concerned that when Elijah is gone, that grace, that prophetic voice for the time will be gone as well. So he doesn't even want to talk about it. If you read the whole chapter, people coming up to him telling him, you know you're going to die, right? And he says, let's not talk about that, because I'm afraid that grace may not stay in the earth. We talk a lot about generational curses. We don't talk enough about generational grace. You can see where the previous generation has room for growth without throwing out the fact that you are standing on the shoulders of that very grace that you are now criticizing. And yes, maybe they didn't go to therapy and maybe they didn't gentle parent, but I am telling you, I don't know where the praying grandmothers are unless somebody in my generation says there was a grace on prayer, there was a grace on worship, there was a grace on going to church, there was a grace on making sure your house was covered, there was a grace on taking oil and bathing the walls of your, there was a grace on that. There was a grace on saying Jesus, 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 Jesus. They needed therapy, but Jesus, Jesus, Jesus broke some strongholds. Jesus, 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 Jesus shrunk some tumors. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus got your hips in church. Jesus, 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 Jesus. I'm not a church mother, but I know there's a grace on what happens when I start saying the name of Jesus. I'm crazy enough to believe that the grace that sent demons scrambling 50 years ago will put a devil on notice in 2023. I believe that there's a generational grace waiting for us to lay hold of. We need a generation that sees that we can't throw everything away because we won't have no power. We need a generation, I hate to be the one to say this, because I sound like an old woman fussing. And you know I'm too fly and too cute to be sounding like an old woman fussing. But there is something to be said about the anointing of a church mother. There is something to be said about the praying father who would get down on his knees. His knees couldn't even handle the weight. But Jesus, 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 Jesus. I don't know about therapy, but I know about Jesus. I don't have money for a prescription, but I know about Jesus. And we need that. And if we drop that, we're going to miss out on the power we need to fight the devils of our generation. Because these devils don't care how cute you are. And these devils don't care how many degrees you have. As a matter of fact, they'll distract you with that to keep you from calling on a name that is above any other name. And Elisha gets in position because he doesn't want to drop the grace. Lord, don't let me drop this grace. Lord, don't let me drop this grace. He doesn't say, I want to be as famous as Elijah. He doesn't say, I want to be as popular as Elijah. He says, I want a double portion of your spirit. When I say I want a double portion of your spirit, it means that I want a double portion of the posture of your spirit that made it possible for you to decree and declare something in the earth and not care how outnumbered you were, because you truly believe that greater is he that is in you than he that is in the earth. I want to pray cancer out of somebody's body. I want to pray deliverance out of some. You don't even have to be in the room when I start praying for you. I want you to get filled with the Holy Ghost on the other side of town, sitting at your child, saying, I got a generational grace that I want to pour into the earth. And Elisha demonstrates the type of hunger you must possess if you want to make sure a generational grace stays in the earth. That grace matters. That grace matters. That civil rights leader grace, it matters. That innovation matters. Getting hosed down with a water hose, that type of generational grace, it matters. Our ancestors had a grace, enslaved, in chain, and still singing. And we get one bad report, one bad email, and we have deconstructed our whole faith. No. I want a kind of grace that can withstand the storms. I want a kind of grace that says, I'll keep serving you, even if I don't know where you're headed. I know we don't want to do it, but I'm telling you, we need something real in this generation. We need something that'll anchor us so that our parents can rest in peace, so that our grandparents' pain was not in vain. We need something to anchor us so my children don't have to fight a devil that's got my name on it. I'm going to handle my giant by the grace of God. Elisha, when I read this text, I can imagine that Elisha was not sure whether or not he had really met the criteria to receive a double portion of Elijah's spirit. He saw the whirlwind, but they don't really say that Elijah died. He didn't see a body. It wasn't exactly foolproof evidence that he saw what happened. So my Bible tells me in this text that Elisha grieves, my father, my father. Then he picks up the mantle. Oh, there's so much power in this mantle. This is not just a coat. This is the same mantle that Elijah threw on top of Elisha's shoulder. I got it, I read it. This is the same mantle that before it was thrown on Elisha's shoulders, when Elijah was hiding and thinking to himself, this is the end, he took that mantle, he wrapped it around his face, and he stood on the top of the mountain. And when God passed by, it hit this mantle. This is not any ordinary mantle. This mantle is evidence that God has been with Elijah every step of his journey. This mantle is evidence that there shall be no other gods before me. This mantle is evidence that he that began this work in you is going to complete it. Elijah said, where I'm headed, I don't need this mantle. But for what God has called you to do, you're going to need this mantle. You're going to need this evidence from the generations that the same grace that allowed Israel to pass through this Jordan, the same grace that allowed us to pass through on dry ground, is the same grace that is going to be with you even when I'm gone. I want to talk to somebody who lost their spiritual covering, and I want you to understand, you may have lost their body, but you did not lose their body, because their body is wrapped up in the spirit that positioned them to cover you. And what you need to ask for, instead of asking God, why did you take them, is say, God, where is the God of my grandmother? Where is the God of my father? Where is the God of Moses? Where is the God of T.D. Jakes? Where is the God they keep talking about? The God that will allow me to be in my lowest valley and still praise. Where is And Elisha, he takes this mantle and he does the very thing he saw Elijah do. Because when you don't know what you have, you just got to work what you know. You just got to work what you know. You don't know what you have yet. You don't know what this thing is going to turn into. And I know you want to know before you get started. But I hear God saying you don't get that kind of grace. You only get the grace to get started. If you have the grace to get started, God says, I got the grace to help you finish. If you got the grace to get up and get moving, I got the grace to make sure that you run your race with strength. If you got the grace to get started, and just ask, where am I? Just ask if I show up. Just ask if I got your back. And Elisha lifts up his hand and he says, where is the God of Elijah? I'm about to put my grace to the test. I'm about to put this grace. I'm going to put this grace to work. I don't know what it is yet. I don't know if it'll do what his did. I don't know if it'll work the way your grace works. But one thing I know is that God gave me something to work with. So I'm going to put this grace to work. And when I put it to work, I'm going to put it to work looking for God to show up. Every time I get ready to preach, I say, God, if you don't want me to do this, don't show up. That'll be the last time I do it. But if you want me to do it, God, make it undeniable that you never leave me nor forsake me. Make it undeniable that my voice matters in this generation. I put God to the test because I want to know. What are the limits? What are the limits on this grace? Oh, I know we gotta go, but I want somebody to know you're just scratching the surface for the limits of the grace that's on your life. I want to talk to somebody who has gone as far as they have ever seen. No one in my family has ever made it this far. No one in my family has ever done it this way. And I don't know where I go from here. God says, I'm glad you don't know where you go from here, because my grace got you started, but my grace is about to take you somewhere that eyes haven't seen, that ears haven't heard. It didn't even enter into the heart of your parents, the things that I have in store for you. If you put your grace to work, I'll make that grace take you places you never thought you would be. You don't even know the limits of what I want to do with you. You don't know the limits of where I want to take you. You don't know the limits of who you're going to be in the earth. I hear God saying, don't be afraid to have grace for what you've never seen done before. Elisha gets exactly what he asked for. A double portion. We've got 8 miracles documented from Elijah. We've got 16 miracles documented from Elisha. That means 8 of those miracles, they almost looked identical to what Elijah did. But there were some miracles that he had preserved just for Elisha that was only for him to unlock. I know you have seen some miracles done before, but God told me to tell you I got some miracles that you haven't even seen performed before. And I'm going to use you to get it done. So while you're trying to imitate what you have seen, I hear God saying, keep your eyes open for what you have not seen. Because what you have not seen are the miracles that I have ordained for you to perform. That's it. The mystery of grace is that it's still unfolding. The mystery of grace is that in our error, we think that we choose the grace, but grace chooses us. Grace chooses us. That idea was birthed in grace. That life started in grace. You were saved by grace through faith in Jesus. Jesus died before you even took your first breath. His grace chose you before you chose him. And now, with the context of the historical, cultural nuances of charis or grace that was translated in the New Testament, I understand why Paul says things like, it is my reasonable service. Because this grace chose me. God said in 1 Kings 19, he told Elijah, take your mantle and throw it on Elisha. He's going to be your successor. But Elisha still asks for a double portion of his spirit, as if he's asking him for something that has not already been ordained for him to receive. Before you ask for it, oh God, something happens when you walk with the Lord, that you begin to ask the Lord for the things he's already decided to give you. Elisha finally aligns with why he has been chosen. But it's not until he puts that grace to work does he see the unfolding of who God has called him to be. I'm finished. I almost called this message Step Into It, because Elisha had to make a decision to not talk himself out of what he saw, to not talk himself out of what he knew. He had to make a decision to step into it, even though he didn't fully know what he was stepping into. I don't really know what this is, but I think I might have a grace for it. I don't know. I don't know, but I'm going to work what I've got so I can discover where the grace is. Everybody in this room has a grace assigned to their name. The first grace you have by being in relationship with Jesus. And if you're not in relationship with Jesus, I want you to come to this altar. Because the grace that we have through Jesus is God's way of making the first move. I'm going to give you something of such high value, even though you have nothing to give me. That's how bad I want to be in relationship with you. And I don't want this relationship to be a one-off where you thank me that you didn't die in the car accident, but you don't live every day stepping into the grace that is assigned to your life. I want to be in relationship with you, says God. Everyone in this room has a grace, and I felt like calling this message Step Into It, because I recognize that there is a doubt that comes when we are exploring the grace that God has allowed to fall into our hands. And yet we have a responsibility to do as Paul did and to step into it, not with a faux sense of confidence, but with trust and belief that it is by the grace of God that I am what I am. And because of that grace is going to be with me as I take this journey. If you're in this room and you're ready to step into the grace that has fallen into your hands, whether that is relationship with Jesus or an expansion of that initial grace, where God has graced you in ministry, in business, and mental health and wellness, and wholeness for your family, I want you to meet me at this altar. And as you make your way to this altar, I want you to imagine that you're stepping into that grace. Oof. You're in this room, and there is a generational grace that you want to see happen in your family. I know the generational curses I want to break, but there is a generational grace that I want to see live on in my family. I want you to meet me down here, because I hear God saying the mere fact that you have the desire for that generational grace to continue